The Eastern Front's winter grip. The cold hit harder than anything he'd ever felt. It wasn't just the icy wind that cut through his coat, or the snow that crept into his boots. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making every breath feel like it froze in your lungs. It was early 1944, and we were somewhere near Vitebsk, Belarus. At least that's where they said we were. It was hard to tell anymore. The landscape was a blur of white, broken only by the jagged remains of trees and the occasional abandoned building. The war had changed since those early days, back in 1941 when we first marched east. Back then, we were full of confidence. The victories came quickly, and we believed in the strength of the Reich. But now, everything was different. The Red Army wasn't retreating anymore. They were pushing us back, day after day, and we were struggling just to hold the line. Our unit had been stationed in the trenches for weeks, maybe months. Time didn't make sense here. It was all a blur of freezing nights and endless days. The trenches weren't like the ones you see in movies, with neat walls and order. They were filthy, filled with mud and snow, and the smell of decay was everywhere. Men coughed, their breath visible in the cold air. Some of the younger ones didn't even bother to put on their helmets anymore. What was the point? A Soviet shell could take you out no matter what. Every now and then, we'd hear the rumble of Russian tanks in the distance. It was a sound that filled us all with dread. There was no mistaking the Soviet T-34s. They moved like beasts, unstoppable and relentless. When they came, it was always the same artillery first, pounding the ground around us, making the earth shake and the sky light up. Then the infantry would follow, pouring in through the gaps like a tide we couldn't hold back. Command had ordered a counterattack a few days ago, something to break the Soviet advance. We'd lost half our men in the first hour. I still remember the faces of the ones who didn't make it back. Hans, who used to joke about everything. Klaus, who never stopped talking about going home to see his newborn son. They were gone now, their bodies left in the snow, buried under the white blanket that covered everything. It wasn't just the battles that were wearing us down. It was the cold, the hunger, the constant fear. Supplies had been running low for weeks. We were surviving on half rations, and even that wasn't enough. Our boots were falling apart, and there was no hope of replacements. The mail from home had stopped coming, and many of us wondered if our families were even alive. One night, I sat with a few of the men, huddled around a small fire we'd managed to light with what little wood we could find. The flames flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the walls of the trench. No one spoke. There wasn't much left to say. We all knew what was coming. The Soviets wouldn't stop. They never did. It was only a matter of time before they broke through, and when they did, we'd have no choice but to run if we were lucky. As the fire began to die down, I stared out at the horizon. The night sky was clear, and the stars seemed so far away, cold and indifferent. I thought about home, about the life I had before all of this. It felt like a different world, a different time. The war had taken everything from us. Our hope, our future, even our sense of who we were. The next morning, the order came. We were to fall back to a nearby village. The Soviets were on the move again, and we had to retreat before we were surrounded. The retreat wasn't organized, it was chaos. Men stumbled through the snow, some of them too weak to carry their gear. We left behind the bodies of our fallen comrades, buried in the snow, forgotten by a war that had no mercy. As we marched through the frozen wasteland, I realized that the war wasn't about victory anymore. It was about survival. We weren't fighting for glory or for the right. We were fighting to stay alive, to make it through another day. And with every step, the weight of that realization grew heavier, like the snow that continued to fall, silent and cold. The retreat to Kovel. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the distant sound of artillery. The Soviets were close. We could feel it in the air, the tension, the anticipation. Every now and then, we'd hear the crack of a rifle in the distance, followed by a long silence. It was a waiting game, and the Soviets knew it as well as we did. They were probing our defenses, testing us, wearing us down before the final assault. We were exhausted, half frozen, and starving. The march from Vitebsk had taken its toll. Men stumbled through the snow like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their faces gaunt. The cold was relentless, biting at any exposed skin. My fingers felt numb inside my torn gloves, and I wasn't sure if they'd ever feel warm again. One night, while on watch, I saw them, shadows moving through the trees on the far side of the village, just beyond the reach of our guns. I strained my eyes, trying to make out shapes in the darkness, but all I could see were vague outlines. They moved silently, like hunters stalking prey. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the trigger of my rifle, waiting for them to make their move. But they didn't. Not yet. In the village, we dug in as best we could, fortifying the remains of the buildings, setting up makeshift positions in the rubble. We didn't have much ammunition, but we rationed it carefully, knowing that each bullet would count when the time came. The tanks were gone. What was left of them had been destroyed in the retreat. We were on our own now, just infantry, armed with rifles and a few machine guns. At some point during the chaos, I was separated from the others. I found myself alone, trapped in a narrow alleyway between two crumbling buildings. The Soviets were everywhere, their shouts echoing through the village. I ducked behind a pile of rubble, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. The command had told us to regroup, to hold this position for as long as possible, hold the line they always said. But what line was there to hold? We were outnumbered, outgunned, and the Soviets were advancing faster than we could retreat. Every day, more soldiers deserted or collapsed from exhaustion. Those of us who were left knew that it was only a matter of time before the Red Army found us again. The retreat felt like the end of everything. By the time we reached the outskirts of the village near Kovel, it was clear that the situation was worse than anyone had imagined. We had hoped to find shelter, maybe a warm place to sleep, but the village was nothing more than a collection of ruins. The Soviets had been here before us, and what they left behind was a landscape of charred buildings, shattered windows, and smoke rising from what remained of homes. I took shelter in what had once been a farmhouse. The roof was partially caved in, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, but it was better than sleeping in the open. The snow had piled up against the side of the building, forming a kind of natural barricade. Inside, a few of us huddled together, trying to keep warm. We shared what little food we had: a stale piece of bread, some canned meat that tasted like sawdust. No one complained. There was nothing left to complain about. The days blurred together after that. Each morning we woke to the sound of artillery. Each night we went to sleep wondering if we'd wake up at all. Men who were once full of bravado, who had fought proudly for the Reich, were now just trying to survive. We stopped talking about home, about what we'd do when the war was over. No one believed it would ever end. And with that, I began to move, slipping through the shadows, away from the battle, away from the dying, away from everything I had once believed in. The Soviets attacked at dawn. It started with a barrage of artillery, shaking the ground beneath us, sending debris flying through the air. We crouched low in the ruins, waiting for the inevitable assault. When the barrage stopped, we could hear the sound of boots crunching in the snow. They were coming. I took cover behind the remnants of a stone wall, firing blindly into the oncoming horde. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. Around me, men felt friends I had known for years, comrades who had fought beside me since the early days of the war. There was no time to mourn, no time to think. It was kill or be killed. I'll never forget the sight of them, swarming through the village like a flood. The Soviets came in waves, their soldiers moving with terrifying speed and precision. We fired our rifles, our machine guns, but it wasn't enough. For every Soviet we cut down, 2 more took his place. They overwhelmed us, driving us back through the ruins, forcing us to retreat further into the village. I knew then that the battle was lost. There was no hope of holding the village. We had been outmatched, outnumbered, and outgunned. The only thing left to do was to survive. As the sounds of battle raged on, I made a decision. I wouldn't die here, in this frozen hell. If I had to run, I would run. If I had to hide, I would hide. But I would survive. I would make it out of this village, and somehow, some way, I would live to see another day.